Imagine being trapped in a dark, abandoned house with no way out. Every step you take pulls you deeper into a nightmare, and a terrifying creature with glowing eyes hunts you. But there's only one way to survive. Remember who you are. Stay with us as we unravel this chilling true crime story that will make your blood run cold. Will the sheriff escape? Or will the darkness consume him? Find out, but be warned, this is not for the faint of heart. Watch until the end if you dare. The air in the small town was thick with dread. A chill ran down every spine. It was supposed to be an ordinary morning. But when the sheriff arrived at the old house on Maple Street, nothing about it felt ordinary. He stood frozen on the cracked driveway, eyes fixed on the front door. Something was off. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The silence was deafening. Every window was closed, but a faint smell of something burnt lingered in the air. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. Each step echoed in the stillness, adding to the tension in his chest. Inside, the house felt suffocating. The wallpaper was peeling, yellowed with age, but it wasn't the decor that caught his attention. It was the bloodstain. A large, dark patch soaked the wooden floor. It was fresh. His heart pounded in his chest as he moved closer to the stain, his breath shallow. And then he saw it. A body, lifeless, sprawled across the floor. A woman, her eyes wide open, frozen in terror. Her face was pale, her body twisted in a strange position, as if something had forced her to fall that way. The smell of burnt flesh grew stronger. The sheriff's eyes scanned the room, his stomach churning. He saw the marks. Claw marks. Not from an animal, but from something human. Something violent. He reached for his radio, but as his fingers brushed it, a sudden noise broke the silence. A faint sound from upstairs. A door creaking open. He froze. He wasn't alone. A voice. Soft. Barely a whisper. "I know you're there." The sheriff's blood ran cold. He should have known better than to enter without backup. He gripped his gun, slowly inching towards the stairs. The house seemed to groan, its old frame creaking under the weight of his every step. The scent of decay grew thicker, suffocating. Each second stretched on forever. His hand tightened around the railing, knuckles white. Then a sudden scream. Not from upstairs, but from right behind him. He spun around. The woman, the dead woman, was standing. Her mouth stretched in an unnatural grin. Her eyes were hollow, empty. She wasn't alive, but she was moving, and she was coming for him. The sheriff's breath caught in his throat. He stumbled backward, his heart racing. Her eyes locked onto his. And the grin. It was wrong. Her lips twisted unnaturally wide, as if something was forcing them apart. A cold, heavy sensation pressed against his chest. The room seemed to close in around him. He fumbled for his gun, but his hands were shaking too violently to aim. Her footsteps were slow, deliberate. Each one echoed like a death sentence. The sheriff backed up, his mind screaming at him to run. But his legs wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, frozen in place. The woman took another step, then another. The distance between them was shrinking fast. Her pale skin shimmered with a faint, sickly glow. Her hair, once neat, now hung in wild clumps around her face. He couldn't look away. Something in her gaze kept him locked in place. Like a trance. Her breath was shallow, rattling in her chest. It sounded wrong. A gurgle, like she was drowning on dry land. The sheriff's chest tightened. His mouth went dry. He didn't know what to do. The woman's hand reached out, fingers curling like claws. And then, as if the air itself had thickened, she lunged. Her movements were jerky, unnatural. But she was fast. Too fast. Her cold fingers brushed his arm. The sheriff gasped, a sharp, guttural sound escaping his throat. A violent shudder ran through him. His gun fell to the floor with a hollow thud. He tried to back away, but his legs were frozen, locked in place by some unseen force. He could feel her icy touch seeping into his skin. Like poison. It was draining him, sucking the warmth from his body. He fought to break free. But the harder he struggled, the tighter her grip became. A noise came from her throat. A sound that wasn't human. A low, guttural growl. And in that moment, the sheriff knew. He wasn't going to make it out alive. Her grip tightened, sending sharp pain shooting up his arm. He tried to scream, but his voice was caught in his throat. His pulse raced, drowning out everything else. Her face, twisted, unnatural, moved closer, inching towards his ear. Her breath was like ice, cold and suffocating. "Too late," she whispered, the words sending a shiver down his spine. Her voice was wrong. It didn't sound human anymore. The sheriff's vision blurred. His muscles were giving out. He could feel his strength fading, his body growing weaker with every passing second. The floor beneath him seemed to shift, spinning around him as if the room itself was alive. He couldn't breathe. The walls pressed in tighter. He gasped, struggling for air, but it felt like the air had turned to ash. The woman's eyes, hollow and black, stared into his soul. And then something twisted inside him. A sharp, sudden pain exploded in his chest. The world tilted, and he collapsed to the floor, gasping. His vision dimmed. The woman crouched down beside him, her form hovering above him like a shadow. He could no longer move, no longer breathe. The last thing he saw before everything went black was her smile. Wide. Unyielding. Cold. It was the last thing he would ever see. Darkness consumed him, swallowing him whole. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. When he awoke, everything was different. His body felt heavy, as though he were underwater. His eyes fluttered open, but the world was a blur, twisted and distorted. He tried to move, but his limbs were stiff, unresponsive. A cold sweat coated his skin, and the smell of decay filled his nostrils. Something wasn't right. His chest heaved as he gasped for air, but his breath was shallow, ragged. The room had changed. The walls seemed to pulse with an eerie light. And the woman, she was still there. But now, she wasn't alone. Figures emerged from the shadows, shapes, indistinct and twisted. They hovered around him, their presence suffocating. The sheriff's heart pounded in his chest. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The figures closed in, their eyes glowing in the dark. And then, the woman spoke again, her voice echoing in his mind. "We are the forgotten." Her words chilled him to the bone. He didn't understand. But he felt it, something ancient, something wrong. The figures closed in tighter, their cold, dead eyes fixed on him. Each breath was a struggle. The woman reached out, her fingers grazing his face, her touch like ice. "You're one of us now," she whispered, her voice a mocking lullaby. Her eyes burned into his, hollow and empty. His body felt numb. His vision blurred again, and the figures around him seemed to shift, becoming one with the darkness. The last thing he felt before everything faded was her cold breath against his ear. "You can't escape." And then there was nothing. The world was silent. A suffocating, oppressive silence that weighed down on him like 1,000 tons. But it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of death. The sheriff's eyes snapped open, but the world around him was dark. Not the darkness of unconsciousness, but a deeper, more suffocating kind of blackness. He tried to move, but his body was still frozen, as if bound by invisible chains. He could feel the weight of the air pressing against him, thick and unnatural. And then he heard it, a faint, distant sound. Whispers. Soft, slithering voices, like shadows brushing against his mind. He tried to scream, but his mouth was dry, his voice gone, lost in the darkness. The whispers grew louder, circling around him, growing more frantic, more desperate. His heart raced, the pounding in his chest deafening in the silence. The coldness gripped him tighter. He could feel the presence of something, or someone, lurking in the shadows.
Eyes.
Watching. Waiting. He wanted to escape. To run. But his body was not his own. His thoughts were jumbled, like a puzzle he couldn't solve. Then a hand.
Cold.
It touched his arm, sending an icy shock through his body. He tried to pull away, but the grip was too strong. The woman, the twisted, empty woman was there again, her face inches from his. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, hollow and soulless. "You thought you could escape," she whispered, her voice a soft, mocking caress. The coldness seeped deeper into his skin, and he felt his very essence draining away. "You are ours now," she continued, her words wrapping around him like chains. Her breath was the only sound in the suffocating blackness. And then the grip tightened. With one final pull, she dragged him into the void, where there was no escape, no light, no end. The void consumed him whole, a place where time did not exist, a place where even his thoughts felt distorted, lost in the infinite dark. He was weightless, floating, yet anchored to something deeper, a force that clawed at his very soul. The woman's whispers filled the void, echoing in his mind, relentless. "You cannot wake up," she murmured, her voice a haunting lullaby. Her breath chilled him, colder than anything he had ever felt before. He felt himself slipping, drowning in the suffocating silence. No air, no sound, just the gnawing sense of being watched, of being pulled deeper into a darkness that wasn't just physical. It was a darkness of the mind. The blackness was alive, alive in a way that made his skin crawl. His thoughts twisted, fragmented, as if something inside him was unraveling. Then, a light, dim at first, flickered in the distance. A soft glow, like the faintest heartbeat in the endless night. He reached for it, desperate. But the closer he got, the more it seemed to fade, as if the light itself was running from him. He could feel the grip on his soul tightening. The woman's presence was closer now, her breath brushing against the back of his neck. Her voice, no longer soft, but sharp, full of malice. "You cannot escape." The words slammed into his mind like a brick. He tried to scream, but there was no air, no sound, no release. Just the weight of her voice, pressing against him, suffocating him. The coldness dug deeper into his bones, into his very core. And then, in that moment, the dark figure appeared before him. It was not the woman, but something worse. A shadow, a shape that was both nothing and everything. It loomed over him, its presence more terrifying than anything he had ever known. Its eyes, empty voids, stared down at him, and in that gaze, he saw nothing but pure, unrelenting horror. He could feel it tearing at his mind, at his sanity, as if trying to break him open, to devour him from the inside. The light flickered again, and this time, it did not disappear. He reached for it, reaching with every ounce of strength he had left. But the shadow grasped him, pulling him away, dragging him back into the dark, where there was no escape, no salvation, just endless, suffocating darkness. The darkness pressed in harder, like a crushing weight on his chest. His heart pounded, but it felt as though the beat was no longer his own. The shadow twisted around him, suffocating, tightening its grip on his soul. Every breath was a struggle, every thought a painful reminder of his helplessness. He reached for the light once more, his fingers trembling. But it seemed farther now, as if the distance between him and that flicker of hope had grown impossibly vast. The shadow whispered. It was a sound that was not a voice, but something far worse. A scraping. A low, guttural noise that crawled beneath his skin. "You belong to us now," it hissed, each word like a lash against his mind. His vision blurred. His reality bent and twisted like a nightmare with no end. He could feel his strength waning, his very essence being pulled into the void, piece by piece. His body, once so rigid, began to lose its form. It felt as if he were no longer himself, nothing but an echo of his past. The woman's voice returned, sweet yet venomous. "You will never wake. You will never escape." Her words wrapped around him like chains, dragging him down, deeper into the abyss. He tried to move, to fight, but his body felt foreign, as if it no longer belonged to him. A wave of despair washed over him. Nothing made sense. No escape. No light. Just endless blackness and the gnawing cold of their presence. His mind, once sharp, was now dull, consumed by the weight of the darkness. The shadow loomed larger, its form pulsating in the dark. Its eyes, those empty, fathomless voids, stared into him, through him. And then it spoke again. "You're already gone," it whispered, its voice of final, irrevocable truth. And in that moment, the last remnants of a sheriff's consciousness were swallowed whole. There was no scream, no resistance, just the cold, empty embrace of the void. And then nothing. For a time there was nothing. No sound, no sensation, only the endless dark, swallowing every trace of thought, every glimmer of memory. But then a shift, a crack in the nothingness. A sound, faint at first, like a distant, rhythmic thumping. It grew louder, closer. Suddenly, the darkness began to break apart, shattering like fragile glass. And in the fractured pieces, there was movement. A form, vague at first, but then clearer. The sheriff's body, still floating in the void, his eyes wide open, staring into the black. But now there was something different. A glimmer of awareness, faint but growing stronger. It wasn't just the absence of darkness. It was something else, something more. The void around him began to pulse, as if alive. And then a presence, not the shadow, not the woman, but something else. A voice, soft and distant, echoed through the fragments of his mind. "Wake up." It was a command, a plea, a desperate cry. The sheriff's heart, if it still existed, skipped a beat. His body jolted, an involuntary reaction. But it wasn't enough. The grip of the void was still tight around him, suffocating him. "Wake up before it's too late." The voice grew louder now.
Clearer.
He could feel something pulling at his mind. Something human. A flicker of memory sparked, his name, his life, his duty. It all rushed back in a wave. He remembered the woman, the house,
The blood.
the cold, and then the light that had flickered. It was so close, so close. He focused all his will on it, drawing himself toward that faint glimmer. But the darkness fought back, swirling, wrapping itself tighter around him. The shadow, the thing that had consumed him, was still there, looming, waiting. "You cannot escape," it whispered again, its voice like 1,000 nails on a chalkboard. But this time, the sheriff fought back. He focused on the light, on that tiny spark of hope, and pulled himself toward it with every ounce of strength. The darkness tried to pull him down again, to drag him back into the nothingness. But he would not let it, not this time. And in one final, desperate lunge, he reached the light. And everything shattered. The darkness cracked wide open, the light spilling through like a flood. The sheriff gasped, taking in his first breath in what felt like an eternity. The weight lifted. The air was thick, and his senses rushed back to him. He was no longer floating, no longer trapped in the void. He was back. But where was he? The world around him was blurry at first, like waking up from a nightmare. His vision swam, but slowly, shapes began to take form. The air was cold, too cold, biting at his skin. He was lying on a floor, hard, cold stone beneath him. The sheriff pushed himself up, his limbs heavy, his mind racing. Where was he? The room around him was dim, lit only by a faint, flickering light. He could hear the sound of distant dripping water. His breath came out in ragged gasps as he staggered to his feet. The walls were cracked, old, like the inside of a forgotten dungeon. The stench of mold and decay clung to the air. His heart pounded as he surveyed his surroundings. It was a place of no escape. A prison. A distant memory surfaced in his mind. He had been here before, but he couldn't remember when. Had he been here in life? Or was this some twisted, half-forgotten dream? But the memory wasn't his own. No, it was theirs. A shiver ran down his spine as he realized where he was. He was back in the same house. The same house from before. But this time, it was different.
Deeper. Darker.
The floor beneath him creaked as he moved, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. The walls seemed to whisper, voices unintelligible but unmistakable, like a chorus of the damned. Something was here. He could feel it. He wasn't alone. The air grew colder. He turned sharply, every muscle in his body tensed. And there, standing in the shadow of the far corner, was a figure, a shape, a woman. It was her, the same pale face, the same wide, hollow eyes. But this time there was no smile. Her face was expressionless, almost blank, a twisted reflection of the one he had seen before. His breath caught in his throat. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice hollow and empty, like a distant echo of the past. The sheriff's heart sank. "You belong to us," she whispered, her voice growing louder, more insistent. And then, just like before, the room began to shift. The shadows closed in, folding over him, trapping him in the same nightmare. He couldn't escape. Not this time. And with that, the whispers grew louder, drowning out his thoughts, swallowing him whole once again. The shadows pressed in around him, thick and suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in. His pulse quickened, and for a moment, he thought he might collapse. The woman's form blurred in his vision, as if she were both there and not there at the same time. The darkness seemed to bend and stretch, warping reality itself. Her eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, locked onto his, and he felt his mind being drawn toward them. They were like black holes, pulling at his very consciousness. The weight of it was unbearable. "You can't escape," she repeated, her voice growing colder, more distant, as if it were coming from everywhere and nowhere. He shook his head, trying to push against the pull, trying to break free from her gaze, but it was like trying to swim in quicksand. Every movement felt sluggish, weighted down by an invisible force. The whispers started again, rising in volume, an eerie symphony of voices overlapping, crashing together, each one more desperate than the last. His thoughts became fractured, distorted, as if the darkness was rewriting everything he knew. His memories, his very identity, began to unravel. The air grew thick, and the walls seemed to pulse, as if breathing, alive with something sinister. The woman's form flickered again, and she moved closer, her footsteps silent but certain. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice almost sympathetic now. "There's no way out." He felt her cold fingers brush against his arm, like ice seeping into his skin. He jerked away, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows had him. The air turned frigid, and the ground beneath him seemed to tremble. He tried to scream, but the sound got caught in his throat, choked out by the oppressive weight of the darkness. The woman's form hovered in front of him, her face twisted into something almost pitiful now, but still, those empty eyes. She reached for him again, and this time, he couldn't pull away. It was as though his body refused to obey his commands. He couldn't breathe. The cold spread deeper into his bones, freezing him from the inside out. And then, the whisper stopped. A terrible, unnatural silence filled the room. For a long moment, he thought it was over. that the darkness had finally consumed him, swallowed him whole. But then, a faint sound, a low, guttural growl, rumbled from somewhere deep in the shadows. It wasn't human, and as it grew louder, the sheriff realized that it wasn't just the woman who had been watching him. Something far worse was waiting, and it was coming for him. The growl grew louder, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to reverberate through his very bones. It wasn't the woman. It was something darker, something much older. The shadows around him seemed to stir, twisting and writhing like living creatures. He could feel the temperature drop further, each breath he took turning to ice in his chest. The figure in the corner, her presence was still there, but it was fading, as if she were a mere reflection of something far more terrifying. The growl grew more distinct, more primal. A low, guttural noise, like a beast awakened from a long slumber. And then, the shadow in the corner shifted. It wasn't the woman anymore. The shape grew larger, darker, as if something enormous was taking form right in front of him. His eyes widened as the creature emerged fully from the depths of the darkness. It was something he couldn't have imagined. Its body was tall, covered in shifting shadows, as if it was constantly changing shape. But its eyes, those eyes, glowed a sickly green, piercing through the dark like twin lanterns. Its face was a grotesque mask of features that didn't belong together, mismatched, contorted, twisted into something that should not exist. Its teeth were sharp, jagged, like the remnants of broken glass, and it grinned. A grin that stretched impossibly wide. It took a step forward, and the ground beneath him seemed to tremble with each movement. The air was suffocating, thick with dread, as if the very space around him was alive and feeding off his fear. He tried to move, to fight, but his legs wouldn't respond. It was like his body had turned to stone. The creature loomed over him, its breath hot and foul, like rot and decay. It spoke in a voice that sounded like the very earth itself groaning in agony. "You cannot escape, Sheriff," it hissed. "Not now. Not ever." The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in as the creature's presence filled the space. The shadows around him became oppressive, suffocating him with their weight. He could feel the coldness seeping deeper, not just into his skin but into his very soul. The beast took another step closer, and the sheriff could feel the darkness pressing against him, smothering him, draining him. His vision blurred again, and for a moment, it felt like the very fabric of his existence was being torn apart. The creature leaned in, its rancid breath washing over him, and in a voice filled with malice, it whispered, "There is no escape from this place. You will never leave." And then the world went black. The blackness was all-consuming, a vast emptiness that swallowed every thought, every flicker of hope. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing. No sound, no sensation, just the weight of nothingness pressing in from every side. But then, slowly, painfully, something began to stir. It was a faint feeling at first, a small thread of awareness tugging at the edges of his mind. A fragment of memory, a flicker of life. The coldness still clung to him, the shadows still surrounded him. But now there was something else. A spark. A pulse. The sheriff's mind struggled to make sense of it. He was still here, still trapped in this nightmare. But there was a sense of urgency, a need to escape. The shadows, which had once felt like an endless prison, now seemed to move differently, swirling, shifting, as if the darkness itself were aware of his presence. He wasn't alone anymore. The growl echoed through the emptiness again. But this time it was different. It wasn't the beast, it was something else. Something closer. The whispers returned. Soft at first, barely audible, like a distant murmur. But they grew louder, closer. The sheriff tried to move again, his limbs still stiff and uncooperative, but this time, something within him pushed harder. He fought against the overwhelming cold, the weight of the darkness pulling at his very soul. His vision began to clear just a little. A shape began to form in the distance. A figure. A woman. But not the woman. Not the twisted figure he had seen before. This one was different. She was standing, tall and still, at the edge of the shadows. Her face was obscured, but there was something familiar about her. Something human. And then, her voice, a soft, melodic whisper, reached him. "Do you want to wake up?" she asked. The question was simple, but it felt like a lifeline. A thread of hope in the midst of the overwhelming darkness. He didn't have the strength to speak, but somehow he nodded. The woman's form stepped forward, her presence glowing in the oppressive blackness. For a moment, she seemed to shimmer, as though she were a ghost, a memory made real. But then, her eyes locked onto his. And there was something in her gaze that pierced through the veil of fear. Then, "You must fight," she whispered. The world shifted again. The darkness seemed to recoil from her presence, just a little. And, with that, something inside the sheriff stirred. He wasn't done yet. Not completely. He still had a chance. But the road to escape was not simple. Not by any means. The woman's eyes never left his, her gaze steady, like a beacon in the overwhelming blackness. For a moment, the shadows seemed to hold their breath, watching, waiting. The sheriff could feel the weight of their eyes upon him, like invisible hands pulling at him, trying to drag him back into the depths. But the woman's presence was like a shield, something solid, something real. Her voice cut through the growing tension. "You are not as lost as you think," she said softly, each word like a promise. He wanted to believe her, but doubt gnawed at him, sharp and relentless. How could he escape this place? How could he fight something that had already consumed him? The growl echoed again, deeper this time, a low rumbling that seemed to come from the very ground beneath him. He could feel the darkness shifting, closing in tighter around him, as if it had sensed his momentary hesitation. The woman stepped closer, her form now visible in its entirety, tall, elegant, yet strangely cold. Her pale face was still partially obscured, but the intensity of her eyes never wavered. "You need to remember," she whispered. "Remember who you are." Her words struck him like lightning, the fog in his mind clearing just a little. He was a sheriff, a protector. He had sworn an oath. He had fought for justice, for the innocent. But now, all that felt distant, like a dream fading upon waking. The growl grew louder, a threatening sound that reverberated through his chest. The darkness crept closer, threatening to swallow him whole. "Remember," the woman urged, her voice growing more insistent. The sheriff's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the darkness closing in around him, but somehow, her words grounded him. He wasn't just some helpless victim of fate. He was a man with purpose. He could fight. He could. Suddenly, the world around him twisted again, the shadows closing in with a violent force. The growl became deafening, a terrifying, guttural noise that rattled the very air. The woman's figure flickered like a candle in the wind. And then she was gone. A cold, empty space where she had stood. The sheriff was left alone, the darkness pressing in from all sides. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart thundering in his chest. The growl, now unmistakably close, filled the air. And then a voice, not the woman's, but something darker, more guttural. "You will never escape," it hissed. "You are ours." The shadows writhed, and a shape materialized before him. The creature. The same twisted, nightmarish figure with glowing green eyes. It towered over him, its grin wide, grotesque, full of malice. The air was suffocating, thick with dread. But the sheriff, despite every ounce of terror clawing at him, found something deep within. A flicker of defiance. A spark of his true self. His hand moved, almost involuntarily, to his side. And his fingers brushed against something cold. A weapon. His badge. The symbol of his oath. The darkness recoiled, just a little. And, in that moment, the sheriff knew what he had to do. The creature's grin twisted in an almost mocking way, sensing his resolve. But it didn't matter. He would fight. The sheriff's grip tightened on the cold, familiar object in his hand. It wasn't just a weapon. It was his last tether to the world he once knew. The badge, a symbol of everything he had sworn to protect, was now his only hope in this suffocating nightmare. The creature before him grinned wider, its eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. It took a step closer, its monstrous form looming over him like a predator. The air around him thickened, pressing in from all sides, the shadows seemingly alive, ready to devour him whole. But the sheriff didn't falter. For the first time since his arrival in this cursed place, he stood tall, his breath steady, his resolve hardening. He was no longer just a man trapped in darkness. He was a force, a protector, a fighter. The growl from the creature reverberated through the air, shaking the very ground beneath him. But this time, it didn't scare him. Instead, it fueled him. With a deep breath, he raised the badge high, letting its cold, metallic surface catch what little light remained. The shadows around him recoiled, as though the very symbol of his duty was a weapon they could not comprehend. The creature hissed, its grin fading, replaced by a snarl of frustration. It could feel the shift, the resistance that was building within the sheriff. It lunged forward, its claws slashing through the air, but the sheriff was ready. With a swift movement, he stepped aside, narrowly avoiding the strike. His body moved with precision, the training he had lived by rushing back to him, instinct taking over. He didn't need to understand the creature or this place. He just needed to survive. The beast growled again, its movements erratic, its hunger blinding it. The shadows around it flickered and twisted, growing more unstable with each passing moment. The sheriff took his chance. He moved fast, his hands gripping the badge with all his might, and he thrust it forward. As if responding to his will, the badge glowed brightly, a piercing light that sliced through the darkness, like a blade. The creature recoiled, its snarl turning to a screech of pain. For the first time since his arrival, the sheriff saw the creature falter. The light from the badge grew stronger, pushing back the shadows, forcing them to retreat. The ground shook violently, as though the very fabric of the nightmare was unraveling. The sheriff's heart raced as the creature's form began to dissolve, its growls turning to whispers, then silence. The light from the badge burned brighter, and with a final, deafening roar, the creature vanished into the shadows, leaving nothing but empty space. The darkness receded. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went still. The sheriff stood alone, surrounded by the remnants of a nightmare, the cold air still biting at his skin. But the weight of the shadows had lifted. The suffocating fear had vanished.
He was free.
The sheriff stood in the stillness, the echoes of the nightmare slowly fading from his senses. The air, though cold, felt clearer now. The oppressive weight that had once threatened to swallow him whole had lifted, replaced by an eerie silence. He could feel the weight of his badge still gripped tightly in his hand, its surface now warm against his skin, a reminder of the strength he had found in the face of the unimaginable. The shadows that had once moved with sinister purpose now seemed powerless, scattering into the corners of the room, like remnants of a storm that had lost its fury. The sheriff closed his eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle around him. His chest, once tight with panic, now rose and fell with steady breaths. It was over. He had done it. But as the final remnants of the darkness faded, something shifted inside him. A realization. He wasn't the same man who had entered this place. He had changed. The nightmare had tested him in ways he never imagined, pushing him to the edge, forcing him to confront the deepest parts of his fear. But he had survived. He had fought, not just for his life, but for the very essence of who he was. And now there was peace. The room, once twisted and contorted in the grip of the darkness, was now silent, its features clearer, almost serene. It was as if the world had reset itself, like the final page of a story turning to reveal the closing chapter. The sheriff took one last look around the room, his gaze lingering on the spot where the creature had once stood. But it was gone. And so was the woman. Everything was gone. He turned toward the door, his steps slow but purposeful, his body no longer weighed down by the fear of the unknown. He had emerged from the nightmare, stronger, wiser. And as he stepped into the light of a new day, he knew that he would never forget what he had faced here. But he also knew that he had survived. He was free. And whatever came next, he was ready.